welcome once again to the Open Mic, the show where every week I talk to a very successful writer about their work, about the publishing industry and how they do what they do. This week I've got another great guest for you, but before I get into that, I'm going to remind you that this show is on YouTube, which if you're watching on YouTube, that's obvious, but you might also want to listen to it on the podcast in the car. So we're available on all of the major podcast platforms. You can hit subscribe on any of those, YouTube or any of the podcast shows. And hopefully, if you'd be so kind as to leave me a nice review, that'd be great because that helps other people find the show. And you're going to really want to find the show because if you have any interest in writing or you know anyone that does, because of folks like my guest today. And I am going to come back. That's my little spiel to open the show. It's kind of mandatory, but I'll come back to it later. But I do really want to get into it right away here because my guest today has been called a present-day Edgar Allan Poe, as well as one of the finest short story writers to come into prominence in the 21st century. He's won virtually every award a writer can win. Edgar's, Anthony's, Agatha's, McCavity's, Derringer's. If it's got a name, he's probably won it. I'm currently reading one of his short story collections. It's called The Adventure of the Castle Thief and Other Expeditions and Indiscretions. And I'll just say I have to agree. Art Taylor is the real deal. That book is an eclectic mix of crime fiction, but it really crosses through several different aspects within the genre of crime fiction, from more traditional to noir, and even some somewhat speculative fiction. And it is collectively causing me to lose sleep at night because I just can't turn out the light until I've read one more chapter. So I'm really excited to have Art on the show today. Art, welcome to the Open Mic. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. And good to reconnect after BoucherCon, having met and talked there. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, BoucherCon was my spirit animal. That and Left Coast Crime this year for getting to know a lot of good folks and discovering a lot of new work like yours, which, man, I cannot say enough good things about it because as I noted, I'm reading Castle Thief now, and I know that came out earlier this year. So folks like me who had not discovered it before, tell us a little bit about the collection and what people can expect to find there.
Sure. The Adventure of the Castle Thief is my second collection with Crippen and Landru, who's a small publisher that specializes in short story collections, both historic and contemporary. My first collection was The Boy Detective and the Summer of '74 and Other Tales of Suspense. And you had mentioned I've been very fortunate to win a number of awards from the mystery community. That collection gathered the stories that have won those awards up to that point. So it's was kind of in many ways, a greatest hits, covering about 25 years, hard to believe, of my publications. Crippen and Landru wanted me to do a second collection. And I did have a novella, just the title novella, the new one, The Adventure of the Castle Thief, that I've been working on. And so that's kind of the anchor for the new collection. And it also has another new story in it. Everyone Talks About the Weather, which is a little more experimental. It's one of the final stories in the collection. And then there's a lot of pieces in between, which, as you said, kind of run the gamut of some of the subgenres. There's some lighter fiction. There's some darker fiction. It's stories that were published in online magazines, in smaller magazines or online, and are being gathered together here for the first time. So some new material, and some that would be harder to find stories, I should say, and hopefully a nice mix for folks.
Well, I'm certainly enjoying it because I'm a big fan of the short story as an art form. And I really love anthologies. I've read a lot of anthologies over the last several years. There's just something about that art form and being able to tie everything up in a relatively compact form. You have been in a million anthologies, and of course, as I noted, you're one of the really good short story writers out there. What draws you to this form of writing and this form of storytelling?
Oh, sure. I've had professors, for example, who've talked about how they've written novels, but they can't write a short story, and folks who write a short story struggling to write a novel. I think there's something about different forms that maybe come naturally to people, whether from like sort of inculcated from their reading, or because it's just naturally the way they think. In my case, it's a little bit of both. I grew up reading Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, even from early teenage years, and kind of delighting in the short story as a form. And it seems that my brain kind of works in that way. I often say as much of the writing is done either on the page or on the screen, as much of it is done just walking around or thinking outside, kind of percolate on stuff. And then once it's percolated a little bit, trying to get it down. I can think of a full narrative arc. I can think of scenes, from a short story. And that's something that I can't do with a longer work in quite the same way. It requires a different kind of planning, different kind of thinking, a different kind of pacing. And so the short story just seems kind of naturally suited to me, maybe coming from the reading, but maybe something about the way my brain works, my creativity works. So
Sure. Well, and I noted that the range you work in is really broad, with under the overall umbrella of crime fiction or mystery. How do you decide, or maybe you don't get to decide? Maybe explain it to me how things end up in a collection, and if you have that kind of the power to make those decisions. Are you starting maybe with your own theme, like something that you've decided you want to work with, or do you look back later on all these various stories that you've written for various publications and choose it that way? I mean, how do you come to put together a collection?
Yeah, great questions all. One of the good things about writing short stories is that I do feel like I can try things in a lot of different directions, both in terms of experimentation with form. Some of my stories are more experimental in their structure, and also writing, across the gamut of, the new collection almost had the subtitle "Stories Light and Dark," and I can write across that entire spectrum of things. Now, I say that because it gives me a lot of flexibility. I can try something here in a small space without committing to a novel and to a brand, but that brand is a question that's come up to me. Ed Amar, who's a good friend and great, terrific writer, both short stories and novels, has said, Art, do you ever worry about branding when you're writing something that is light and fun here and something that's darker there? He asked that several years ago, and I had not really thought about it because I was sort of reveling in the freedom to, if I get the feeling to write something a little noirish, which I enjoy reading, I can go in that direction. If I get the feeling to write something a little lighter and funnier and more traditional, because I enjoy reading in those directions, then I can do that too. But it did raise the question of how a collection might come together. I'll admit one of my concerns with The Adventure of the Castle Thief is that there are stories that are at the extreme in either direction. The title story is a more traditional mystery. It's set, and to tell you where the idea came from, this is part of the question you were asking, came from a study abroad that I led for George Mason University, where I teach, and seeing the community of writers, creative writers in that case, and the way that they came together as a group, the friendships they made, the bonds they made, and then sort of percolating in my head about both that and the setting that we were in for one of the stops on the study abroad, which was a castle. The backdrop of the castle, that Gothic atmosphere, all that, the sense of friendship led me to think what would happen if something caused a rift in all that, specifically thefts. And those are the thefts that motivate the story as I wrote it. None of it is based on that group, those kids, but inspired by. And so that's where that idea came. And I thought it needed to be something lighter and something more focused. I wanted to celebrate that community as well. And so that story is more traditional in many ways. That story is a little lighter. I'm going to go to another extreme here. One day we were at a concert. It was in Maryland, and we were walking along. This is my wife, another couple, and I, and we were heading toward the concert in the distance. And over at a truck, parked over to the side, there was a boy, and it was a boy, a teenage boy, who was beating on the window and saying, "Let me in, let me in." And we wondered whether we should go over, intervene, if it was something we should pay attention to, what was happening there. And eventually, kind of uneasily, we went on. But my mind started working on that too. And there's a story in here that builds on that, and it builds in kind of disturbing directions, I think. So my mind will go in different directions, different times, and that's when something is kind of coming from an experience I've had. Stories are inspired by dreams. Stories are inspired by travel. Stories are inspired by something that happened. Stories have been inspired by other stories. In fact, I've read something by David Goodis, which then prompted me to write a story, that goes from there. One story inspiring another. The other side of the question, though, is if there's an anthology call, if there's a certain type of publication that maybe specializes in noir. I think it's like Shotgun Honey. I know there's something that I might want to write there that can go in that direction. Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine is, I won't say more conservative, but certainly they're not going to go toward the more explicit ends, tougher ends of that spectrum. So I know when I write something for them. Right. So I'm gonna write toward the publication. So that's a determination as well, what an anthology's editor wants, or what a publication, generally is geared toward. So it's a combination of what I'm looking for and what I know is sought out there.
Man, you said a lot of stuff there that I want to follow up on because.
Sorry, yeah, I rambled.
No, that's perfectly fine. I often tell people, I have all these questions that I come into this with because I try to do my research. I'm a reporter by trade, but you guys always say something far more interesting than what I was going to ask. So I love to follow up on that because I know the story you're talking about. I just finished the story you were talking about with the kid banging on the window, and the thing that I'm really liking about this story, this collection of stories, is how none of them go where I think they're going to go. You are a master of the twist or of the misdirection and I mean that in the best possible way, because as a reader, you don't necessarily want to know how the thing's going to end after you've read the first page, right? You want to be surprised, and you're a master at that. And that story in particular, I wasn't sure where that was going, but you also don't make that ending overly clear. You tend to leave things a little ambiguous. And I love that. If you don't mind, follow up on those two things a little bit, the twist, and then maybe the ambiguity of how you let something finish, because it's an art. It really is a skill that a lot of us don't have, right? We just blunt you over the head with something, and you're so much more subtle with it. So, tell me a little bit about that and your thinking about that.
Sure. Before I say it, I'm going to preface it with a response to something else you said, which is about preparing questions. I mentioned teaching at George Mason University. I do extensive lesson plans, what questions I'm going to ask and all like that. There have been many times when I'll come in and the students are talking about what they'd read, and I just throw out the lesson plans. I'm like, all right, let's follow what you're talking about. Let's go where you want to go. So it's that flexibility is something which I think can, as you said, it's always very nice to me to see somebody on that side, the student side, who's enthusiastic and going in a direction. I'm like, I'll follow you. Those are really good questions, though, the ones you just came up with. And I appreciate the comments on my story. I had a writing professor many years ago who writes speculative fiction. His name's John Kessel, and he writes science fiction, speculative fiction. And he said, what he always likes in a short story is a sudden left turn. So this is one thing that has been on my mind. It's like, how are you going to take the reader in something that's going to be, same as with a ride. If you were in the passenger seat of a car, sudden left turn, it's like, whoa, hold on, let me go where it's going. A little more academic. I've been read, I guess it's been 2 years now since I read it, but George Saunders' A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is all about looking at some Russian writers, short story writers, Chekhov, Tolstoy, Gogol, and Turgenev, and seeing what we can learn as writers from that. And there's a brilliant first chapter he's got there where he looks at Chekhov's In a Cart, or In the Cart, I think is the way it's translated. And he said, page to page, here's what the reader expects from what you read on one page. And then Chekhov says, no, let's do another one. And then you expect something from that page, and it's like, nope. And it's not huge twists and shifts, but it is taking readers' expectations and going in an unexpected direction, taking them in an unexpected direction. I try to do a lot of that in what I'm doing. And some of that requires, I'm an extremely slow writer, unfortunately. I mentioned about percolating, about doing, so a lot of times I'm working on a little scene in my head here, takes a while there, and then I'll fill in something from the beginning, and then I'll change things. So I take a while to write. But I also find myself that once I've got things down there, and this may sound a little too new agey, but I try to step back and just listen to what I've written and see, like, what are the seeds that are there and where might they grow, to use that kind of metaphor. What direction might these things grow in? And so some of it is trying to, with the story that we're talking about, and I'm embarrassed to say that I cannot remember the name of it. It's been years since I wrote it. The one about the man who sees somebody in a truck and goes over, and he actually does intervene in the story.
Right.
But there's a part in when I was writing, when I was drafting it, where he's thinking about his estrangement from his wife, and sort of not estrangement from his daughter, but some distance from his daughter as his daughter's growing up. And at the beginning, that was just kind of like backstory. That's a little bit of character building. But as I kept writing the story, it seemed like that those were the things that would be urgent on his mind, and thinking about the safety of his own daughter, and thinking about what's happening in this truck, and how his daughter's growing up and growing away from him. And so it seemed like a lot of that needed to come together at the end. But I think with an ending, you don't want things to come together and be tied up somehow. I really don't think that's as satisfying to a reader. And I've talked to short story writers who feel differently from me. But I feel like that if a reader is left with a little something extra to kind of think about, I won't go so far as to say be uneasy about, though I think that's part of it as well. But if they're left with something where it's like, I've got to think about this, I got to figure out what's happened, or a layer where it's like, seems to be a happy resolution, and yet there's some sort of, there's a gray cloud to the silver lining. That I think gives a reader a little something to engage with, as opposed to, all right, that's done, put it away. I want them to walk away from the reading, from the experience, still thinking about it, and maybe thinking about it the next day or beyond. I think some of the stories that, and I'm trying to come up with one that I could talk about. There's a couple that I would usually come back to, but the stories that have stayed with me are the ones that leave me with that sense of not just that they're unfinished, but they're ambiguous in some way, or I'm left to puzzle through something myself. Those are the ones that stick with me emotionally or intellectually, and I'd like to bring that to the reader as well.
Well, I find a lot of the writers I like the most in this day and age have those little gaps. And I don't mean like holes in a story. It's like there is a skill to what you don't write as much as to what you do write. And I see that again, like saying a lot of the writers in this genre that I like, they don't. I have Elmore Leonard in my head when he's saying, leave out the parts that readers skip. And so maybe there's some of that, but there's another story in the current book about the couple that go to the hotel to have this experience based on this tragedy that happened at the hotel before. And I don't want to say too much. I don't want to give it away to anyone who might go get the book, but I had to read the first page a few times to be sure I understood what I was reading. And then, of course, then it all made sense. But to support, I suppose, what you just said, after I read it, I could not stop thinking about it. And then, because at the end, too, there's also a big time gap. But it works. It all works. So the gaps are in the right places. Sometimes there's information gaps that don't work at all. But I haven't read all of the stories in the book yet. I'm not completely through it, but clearly I've read enough of it that I see that this is a big part of your style. And again, as a, I like to think of myself as a thoughtful reader. God knows I read enough of this, right? It's a unique style. You are not neatly in this box of, you mentioned Shotgun Honey or any of the other ones, right? Where they do want you to be really somewhat straightforward because readers have this expectation. your stuff has just enough of that twist or that unexpected or that, like I say, the an appropriate gap that it's really unique. And again, if you're interested at all in short stories, I'm telling you, go find Art's books. You're not going to regret it. Anyway,
Thanks much.
just I'm you've made a fan here, obviously, so that's
Yeah, and I appreciate thanks for all that, and I appreciate your shout out for the White Rose of Memphis. I did remember the title of that one.
Oh yeah,
It's that was a story that came out of a dream, a nightmare, a little bit, and it's sort of the confluence of the true crime craze on the one hand, and this idea of some odd kind of almost fetishistic tourism where we visit places where bad things happened, and so it's the combination of those. But your point is a good one. I do. It's always a balance. I want to give the reader enough to engage, but I also want to leave some space there for the reader to bring themselves into the story. As I always say, it is not reading, I think, should not always be just a passive experience. It should be something where we're engaged and maybe even going so far as to, bring ourselves, our own experiences into the storytelling. Let a reader bring their emotions in, as opposed to just like splaying emotions across the page, because I think that some alchemy happens there. But same thing with information. Let a reader fill in some of the blanks, and I hope that I give enough where they can fill in the blanks productively rather than leave confused in any way. And it's always a balance.
Right. Well, in that particular story, I think it resonated with me as well. My wife and I were recently in Las Vegas for a little bit, and just a few days, and you go to do this, do that. We don't gamble, so we're doing other things. But it made me think that there was almost nothing in this day and age that you can't get as an experience, right?
Yeah.
And I was half seriously saying, one of these days, I guarantee, because we were at the Mob Museum, which is great. If you ever go to Vegas, make some time, go to the Mob Museum. It's really good.
I didn't even know there was one. I will.
So. Oh my God, if there's a museum program, we went to a burlesque museum. There's the Pinball Hall of Fame. There's the Liberace Museum. You name it, Vegas has it.
Oh yeah, wow.
So, but I was pontificating that, one of these days there is going to be someone that does a prison experience thing where you can pay money and you can, for a couple of hours, you can be incarcerated, which there is kind of something like that. If you ever go to Alcatraz outside San Francisco, you can, well, they don't let you do it anymore because I guess people were getting stuck, but you used to be able to go into jail, into a cell, and they would close the door, and, you get to experience what it was like to, hear the jail cell close on you and all that kind of thing. But that's what it really made me think of, that as like, oh my God, that. And then, you mentioned dark tourism. I've seen a whole Netflix series on dark tourism, and we are drawn as a species to these dark things. And I mean, thank God, because that's how we all write in this world. But how do you explain that, especially when you talk to your students about the attraction that we have to these darker aspects of the human experience, up to the point of wanting to recreate a horrible thing that happened in the past?
Yeah. I'm teaching next semester a course in true crime. Is one that I've taught. This will be my third time teaching it. And we use the Library of America's, as part of the text, Library of America's 1-volume true crime, anthology, looking from way back in the earliest days of America, up to, I think it goes up into the early 2000s. But one of the things that Harold Schechter, the editor, says is talking a little bit about our desire to see that. Why are we drawn to watching this? And I think there's part of this that is a sort of like in the same way the cliche goes, watching a car wreck, you're going to not take your eyes off of it. But I think there's also the attraction to the what if. What are the capacities to try to figure out what people could do and how could they do that? And there's a curiosity about that. I don't think it's just a morbid curiosity, but also like how could we as a species do this sort of thing? What drives a person to that? Those sort of questions, I think, are ones that weigh with us. Megan Abbott, and I'm not going to be able to quote it very well. It's been a while since I've read it, but Megan Abbott wrote an essay that I read several years ago that talked about why women in particular are drawn to true crime. And I'm not going to try to, I will point people in that direction. I'm not going to even try to paraphrase it because I will do it injustice. But I think there's something about this, what draws us toward this fascination with and fear of these kind of stories that is in itself fascinating. And I don't know that I entirely understand.
I talk to writers a lot also about character development. And this is almost always, of course, in the context of a full-length novel. What's your approach to character development writing in the short story form? I know you have to paint a picture really fast, but is there any standard method or process to how you do this for short stories, or is it very individual?
I think it's individual, story to story. In some cases, it is. I have a little bit of information, some key information that I feel like is necessary about a character, but it is not where I have to go and say, do a full character inventory. This is a phrase I use with my kids, where you're writing down every bit of history that you can, as much as you can, about their personality, their fears, their dislikes, what they like to eat for breakfast, what they don't want to eat for lunch, what they dreamed about last night, where they want to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I think some of that is maybe really good, for the novelist. I won't say with me, I don't know my character. I think in many cases I do. But it does depend on the story, how much I need to do and how much I need to go into. I always find myself, a lot of folks ask the question at panels and things like that, do you start with character, or do you start with plot? Do you start with the situation? And with me, it's like, well, it can start in many different ways, but they're so interlinked that a lot of times I'll have a situation, but then I have to step back and be like, well, who is this character and why would they do that? I don't need their full history to know that, but I feel like I need to get some inkling of understanding about what's motivating them in order to understand the next scene or what might happen next. And then it's like, all right, and then what's a plot twist to throw at this character? And then you back up and say, well, what would this character do? So I say all that. I have at times done the kind of character inventory where I step back and write a bunch of things out, try to begin to free write or sketch, what's the character's history? How many siblings do they have? And what was their college years like, or something like that? Not always.
Right. You have also edited multiple anthologies. I know a lot of them have a theme, but in general, what do you look for in a great short story? What catches your eye as an editor when you're reviewing all of these possibilities?
Sure. It's I used to have it taped on my computer, but John Updike said a long time ago, 3 things a short story needs to capture my attention in the very opening, in some way in the opening. It needs to broaden or deepen my understanding of the world or humanity in the middle of it. And then it needs to end with a sense of completed statement, not resolution, but completed statement. That's highfalutin. But I do find that I want to have my attention captured in the beginning. It can be by the language, or it can be by a character, or it can be by a plot twist, but I want to be gripped in some way. Now, let me make it clear that I don't think that needs to be always a body in the first paragraph of a short story, since we're talking about the mystery genre. But I think something needs to sort of like startle me, bring me in some way. And then I want to see some kind of mastery of scene building or pacing throughout, where it is not just kind of flat, this happened, dialogue, but rather there's some sort of control of the prose. And I do find myself, I like both an ending that may be both surprising, but also not just like everything's, as I said, tied up in a neat bow. Not to say I haven't read stories that I do like that, but I like something that sort of ends with a flourish. Mm-hmm. one of the challenges of being an anthologist, and I use that word very lightly. I've done 3 anthologies, so I don't know that I count myself as an anthologist, but I've done 3, 2 of them for BoucherCon, um, is getting a good mix of things in there. And I do like anthologies that seem to have not just one tone or one atmosphere or one feel, but where one story might be funny and one story might be darker, one story might be told mostly in dialogue, and one is more, dense, prose heavy. So I'm looking for texture and variety there. And another of the challenges is how many, especially when you think of like trends, but how many writers are often writing in some of the similar directions. When I did the Murder Under the Oaks, the BoucherCon anthology for Raleigh, we had 4 stories that had either elderly protagonists as detectives or elderly protagonists as victims, or something about like older people being taken advantage of. I also had 4 stories that were about women whose partner, spouse, boyfriend, whatever, had done them wrong and they were seeking revenge. And I found myself thinking, we can't have 4 each of these kind of stories in here, so it's like, what's going to rise to the top? And in that case, what I'm looking for is somebody that is treating what I want to say a common theme or a usual theme or a trope or whatever, but they're doing something interesting with it, enlivening it some way. And I think that's part of the challenge with short stories as well. A lot of stories I read and I'm like, well, I know where this is going from very early on, And so what I want to get, and this is what we were talking about before, what I want to get is them to be like, oh, didn't expect that. That's a twist. That's something new. And so those are the kind of the many things I think about when I put together the books that I put together.
Since we're talking about anthologies, I remember many years ago, it's been probably late 90s now. I was talking with an agent at a conference about a nonfiction manuscript that I was working on that I was hoping to get some interest in. Short version is she was not interested in that one at all, but she seemed to be very intrigued by a different idea I had, which was a collection of short stories based on songs by the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
Because I'm not really a very smart guy, I kept pursuing the manuscript that she thought was a dud, and I never followed through on the other idea. So fast forward now, all these years later, and I see many, many, many anthologies based on the songs of fill in the blank. I've read many of them, from Jimmy Buffett and Bruce Springsteen and Johnny Cash, and I hear they're doing one on songs that I think of Genesis and any other groups. What's your take on this trend? I mean, I've read enough of them, so clearly I'm an audience for them. But what's your take on that as a trend?
I think it's fun. Joe Clifford was really kind of the one that led this in many ways with the Bruce Springsteen, the Johnny Cash ones, and it was like, man, that is a terrific idea. Josh Pachter has established himself as kind of the person to do these. The most recent one is "Happiness Is a Warm Gun" with the Beatles. I think it's fun. We contributed to one, which unexpected, Joni Mitchell. But my wife and I, Tara Laskowski, submitted a story, a collaboration we did to the Beat of Black Wings, and so I think I think it's fun both from a writer perspective and from a reader perspective. In part because if you're a fan of name that tune, name that musician. If you're a fan of so-and-so, then I want to see what was done with some of the songs that I really like and how they could put a twist on it. The Go-Go's anthology that Holly West did, big Go-Go's fan, it's like, all right, I want to see this. I want to see that. I've actually had, songs it kind of inspire me as well, in part because of being invited to something like that, but also in part because I listen to a lot of music, and I listen to music while I write, and so sometimes a phrase or a feeling I get during a song is going to help. I bring this up. There are 2 stories in the collection. One story in the collection, one story that was in a pamphlet that goes with the collection. The Adventure of the Castle Thief, the hardcover edition, has an extra story in it. that were inspired by songs by Lou Reed. I was invited to that anthology. It's a longer story. Why those stories were not ultimately in the anthology. I don't need to go into all that now. But it was terrific trying to think about which Lou Reed songs I wanted to respond to think about the ways that they spurred me on to be kind of excited about that. In the middle of writing one of the stories, though, was when Lord's Melodrama came out, and that album is as much an inspiration or as much an impact on the story I was writing as the Lou Reed that I was listening to. So music, I think it's something that we, that is such a shared experience, but also has such a tremendous personal impact on folks, the connections we have to songs or how it makes us feel, that I think as inspiration, it's really nice, really good.
Yeah, I was like I say, I was bummed for myself that I didn't actually follow up and do any of that myself. But I've loved almost all of the ones I've read.
Yeah.
Like I say, and you mentioned Joe Clifford. He's been on the show a couple different times, and yeah, I think I read the Springsteen one, and I can't remember if he did the Johnny Cash one or not, but just
I think he did. Yeah.
it's interesting to me, and it's one of the beautiful things about talking to creative people, which I love so much, is to be able to take the germ of an idea that a creative person put out there in this one vision, and to take something of it to inspire a different vision. And the irony to me is, if you know anything at all about music and the history of music, that is the history of music, especially in the modern last 100 years, and and rock music in particular. There's almost no original anything or the first of anything. Everything is based on something that a songwriter heard somewhere else, or a song that inspired them, or and they just keep. It's more like something they keep building on, as opposed to something that's completely unique. So I actually do like to see that in the writing too. I love to see something taking Folsom Prison Blues and finding a different way to create art with that. I love that stuff. So that's really great.
The stories in those books I like, in those anthologies I like the most, are the ones that go away from the song. A lot of singer-songwriters are storytellers as well. But if you're replicating what's there, that's not as interesting as if you take part of it and then go in a different direction. I think that's fun. Absolutely. And I will say what you were saying about writers that, I mentioned how a David Goodis story inspired my story, The Odds Are Against Us. And it was like just reading Goodis led me to this story, which ended up, it was one that won an award, which is very nice. But the story that we've been talking about, whose name I can't remember, the one that set at the concert with the band, I wish I had my copy close enough I could look it up. But Patricia Abbott, Megan Abbott's mom, wrote to me and said, that story made me think of a story. Do you mind? And I was like, absolutely not. You would not tell from reading the story that she wrote and reading my story together there's any connection between them. And yet one built from the other. And so I think it's fascinating the way that art works in those ways.
Absolutely. And it reminds me, the question, I know I've had a lot of writers tell me they hate this question, and that, it's where do you get your ideas, right? They hate being asked that. And I understand why, because look around, listen, pay attention. There's a story idea everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. I only have a couple more, but
sure, yeah.
And this is maybe that esoteric question I warned you about earlier. Okay. It's a hard business. And most of us fail as much or often more than we have success. So in that regard, I think the most important thing for anyone when they come into this game is to know what you want out of it, right? What level of publication or acknowledgement or whatever will make you the most satisfied. I mean, if you're only going to be happy with a Big 5 publishing contract and a New York agent and all that stuff, great, real hard. But keep at it. If that's your goal, then keep at it. If your goal is just to get something out there and you're fine with indie or even going self-publication, whatever, that's all fine too. It's what you want out of it. So I wanted to ask you that question. What is your perspective on on achieving happiness as, as an artist and a writer in this era of publishing? Do you have a concept of what, makes you satisfied with what with your work and how it is received?
Yeah, that is a super tough question, and to be honest, it's one that I kind of wrangle with and continue to wrangle with. I cannot overemphasize how fortunate I've been with story publications, with editors embracing my work, with readers being kind to my work, and with award recognition. I don't think I could ask for anything more in those directions. At the same time, there is this sense of like, well, when are you writing a novel? When are you getting the novel? I did have one novel that came out. It was a novel in stories, so it was sort of a cheat, with 6 stories, one make up a novel. And so part of me feels like, well, yeah, I should write that novel. I have a couple of ideas there. And so the question you're asking is one that that's I'd wrangle with, because at times it's like, gosh, I'm working on a story now. I'm feeling good about it. I'm very proud when it comes out. I hope it will come out in the place where I'm aiming to send it to them. I'm very proud of that, and I feel good about it. And yet a part of me is like, why are you writing this when you should be working on the novel that is languishing on your computer? Because that might get so these are questions that I wrestle with, and I don't know that I know the answer to it. I think the way you formulated the question is a really good one, though, because I think it's like, what is it that you want to to see your name in print, or to get the big money, or to say, I got this story that was inside of me out, and somebody read it and somebody got it. I'm going to close this part of the rambling with the fact that I got a note from a reader one time, and it was about the time travel story that I wrote for Barb Goffman's anthology Crime Travel. And she wrote, and she said, she said, I'm a victim of trauma. I'm a kind of paraphrase a little bit. She said, I'm a victim of trauma. She said, and your story, I think, is the one that best understands what trauma feels like and the long lasting effects of trauma. And she said, thank you. That was something really important to me. And to have the idea that somebody read your work and it meant something to them. And I'm not alone with this. I've heard this story from other folks, short story writers, novelists. Somebody reaches out and said, your story meant something to me. That means a lot. And that may wipe away some of the other stuff.
That's hard to top. It really is. That's really high praise, because why else do we do it? Look, I know there are people who write it because they think they're going to get famous and make a lot of money. And okay, again, that's legit too. That's what you want. But you kind of hope that as a creative, as an artistic mindset person, that you also want to touch people in some way.
Yeah.
Whether you make them laugh, make them angry, make them, think.
Yep.
There's nothing I love more than waking up in the morning and I'm still thinking about a story I read the night before. That, that's when I want to send the writer an email and go, damn, you got me, man. You got me on that one. So
me too. From a reader, that's what I want. So that's what I want from that experience. Well,
I like to wrap up the show on with a question that I hope is a fun question. I always mean for it to be a fun question, challenging question maybe. So let's just say I had the magical power to put you together with one of the following 3 people, just one of them. Who would you choose and why? And I try to have a theme with these, and I'll let you. I'll see if you pick up the theme. I'm guessing you will. But the options I'm going to give you are Mark Twain, Flannery O'Connor, or Franz Kafka. I can put you together with one of those 3 for whatever, drinks, conversation, dinner, bike ride, whatever
sure.
How you want to spend your time with them. Who would you choose and why?
Well, I imagine a couple of them would be more just entertaining than the other, in some ways. Flannery O'Connor had a huge impact on me, when I was coming along, as a Southerner myself, Southern writer who was writing sort of quirky things that had great weight and great impact. She's a tremendously good prose stylist as well. So I'd have to go with Flannery O'Connor. I hear she's very delightful as a person. Obviously was very delightful as a person, and very entertaining. So I think that would be her, and it wouldn't have to be talking craft or anything like that. I think just kind of hanging out over some sweet tea, maybe. I don't know.
There you go. That's a very Southern thing.
Yeah.
Way to spend some time. So, well, Art, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Love learning some insights into you and your work. I'm going to repeat myself here again, folks. If you haven't picked up one of Art Taylor's books, I highly recommend it. His collections of short stories, or found him in any of the numerous other publications that are out there. Really, really good writer. I'm really glad we got a chance to meet and to have you come on the show. And I'm really glad I read your work. So hang on there.
Yeah.
Right?
No, this was terrific conversation. You're a great interviewer, a great conversationalist, and I appreciate all of it. So.
Oh, absolutely. Well, folks, I said I was gonna circle back to the commercial, and I do as I say. If you haven't hit subscribe, please do so. It will help people find the show, and will help them hopefully connect with some of the folks who come on the show and share their insights into how they do what they do and the publishing industry, the art and craft of writing, and all of that good stuff. I know there's a lot of folks out there who go on and you spend a lot of money on craft books, and I'm not going to discourage you necessarily from doing that, but I'm just saying if you come here, you can hear it straight from, in their own words, and easy to listen to in the car too if you're on the podcast. So anyway, Art, thanks again. Really appreciate it. Last thing I'll leave you with, folks, is the same thing I always leave you with, which is tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. Until next time, for my guest, Art Taylor, for myself, Rich Eisen, for my two English setter dogs who are around here somewhere. They're normally right behind me sleeping, but they're off somewhere else today. I will say this has been the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words. I will see you next time. Take care.